Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we check in on the managerial search and a potential GM search after the departure of Kim Ng from the Marlins. If you need a good laugh, we look back at our predictions from the 2023 Mets season. Woof! We close out the show with our offseason wish list and answer your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And here's your reminder to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, it is that time of year. It is the offseason for us. Low-key, our favorite time of year, unless the Mets actually make a World Series run sometime soon. We love this, and we have a lot to go through today. Towards the back half of the show, we're going to get into our offseason wish list. We'll do team needs. We'll talk about some free agents, maybe even some trade targets. But we'll keep with the current news as David Stearns gets to work for the Mets in a lot of different capacity. And Joe, I think at the top would be the GM situation. We don't know if the Mets are going to urgently operate to fill a GM role after the departure of Billy Epler. But I will say, besides the field that exists, a new name now available after a surprising departure of Kim Ng from the Marlins, who the Marlins went to the playoffs this year. Obviously, one of those teams out there that has limited resources in the offseason. I think Kim Ng, not only breaking barriers, being a woman in the GM role of baseball, did a really, really good job with this franchise. And it sounds like there was a power struggle there. You and I were discussing off air. Maybe the Mets GM job wouldn't be particularly high for her because it's still working under somebody, but another smart baseball person out there and available.
I mean, I don't know if Joe Douglas wants to give up his job anytime soon. Maybe Kim Ng will come for that.
Well done, Joe.
When you talk about her fit with the Mets, I find it hard to believe that she's going to want to come here. I know there's been people that said the Mets could throw her a bunch of money. She's from Queens or the New York area, whatever. Kim Ng earned the right to run baseball operations in Miami. She led the Marlins to the playoffs for whatever making the playoffs is worth. She led the Marlins there, and we can make fun of the playoff format all we want, but guess what? Here, the Mets Pod, we're talking about a team that didn't make it. So we can't exactly sit in that seat. But Kim's a fantastic executive, a trailblazer. If I were the Boston Red Sox, she would jump right near the top of my list as a candidate to take over baseball operations in Boston. If I'm the Mets, I'm certainly calling her and saying, are you interested? I can't imagine she is. I imagine her vision is to run baseball operations. And, maybe this year, if she cannot get the Boston job, is something where maybe she goes to work for MLB for a year. And she's been, she's worked in the MLB office before, so she could take an executive role there for a year or so until more jobs open up and an opportunity could come about for her. And also from the Mets side, too, if we're looking at Kim Ng as someone that wants to run baseball for an organization, do we really want her to be like a bridge, use the Mets as a bridge? As great as it would be to have someone of her caliber in this infrastructure, it feels like just not a great fit for both sides, because I think the Mets and David Stearns, whenever they hire a general manager, whether that's this offseason, next offseason, whenever the case may be, I think they want it to be similar to how Cleveland operates, where they have Antonetti and Chernoff as president of baseball operations and GM, and they've been in those roles forever, and they turned down the opportunity to go anywhere else. I think David Stearns will be looking for his version of that front office style.
I'm with you. It's worth bringing up her name because she's an amazing candidate and, quite frankly, an overqualified one for the position that the Mets are looking to fill. And, I saw Jeff Passan say that the organization tried to hire someone over her in baseball operations. So why would she jump somewhere where she's working under someone that runs baseball operations? So, obviously this is a long shot situation, but here's the thing. We don't know a lot about the Mets GM search. We don't know if they are interested in anyone right now or if they have more urgent matters, which we'll get to the managerial search in just a moment, which is a more urgent matter because they need a manager for this team next year. They don't need a GM next year. David Stearns can run the offseason on his own with the employees the Mets have and continue to find the best candidate for that GM job. And for her, I like that you bring up Boston. I mean, it feels like not only a high-profile job because it's the Boston Red Sox, but an open one and one where she would have more resources to operate with, and she's already passed the test with the Marlins. So definitely an interesting story amongst baseball, all of baseball. And in the offseason on the Mets pod, we do talk about national baseball stories. But back to this organization, the managerial search. Joe, to me, it is bizarre that we are more than halfway through October. We've had the David Stearns press conference. We've had the podcast discussing the press conference. I have not heard or seen a single name mentioned outside of Craig Counsell in a serious manner. I mean, sure, there's always talk shows and they'll throw out this name or, Joe Madden wants to be the manager of the Mets, whatever it is, right? But Craig Counsell is legitimately only the actual name we've heard connected to the organization, where it makes you wonder, are they waiting out his contract and they know something we don't? Or are they just slow playing this entire managerial search?
I said it on last week's show. Until I hear another name, I'm going to operate on the thought that they know shortly after October 31st, when Craig Counsell's contract expires, they have access to him and they believe they're going to get him. Because one thing I do wonder if this plays in any way, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. It's just me kind of thinking out loud. Craig Counsell is not competing for your job. If Craig Counsell goes to free agency, he's interviewing kind of with an intent to hire. I don't think it's going to be, all right, Craig, we're going to interview you, and then we'll also interview Joe Espada and Carlos Mendoza and name another bench coach from somewhere else or whatever, like list the Joe Madden and list these names. And then, all right, Craig, come back for round 2 of interviews with 2 other people. Craig Counsell is the kind of guy, much like David Stearns was for the president of baseball operations position. If you talk to Craig Counsell and he's interested, he gets the job. So I wonder if they are waiting on the contract to expire, see where Craig Counsell's head is at, and if he doesn't want to come here and he wants to stay in Milwaukee or he wants to pursue a different opportunity, then you can run the hire process at that point. Right now, there are a couple managerial openings, and the only people that have done any interviews are the Giants, to my knowledge, and they've only interviewed internal candidates. So I don't know if this is just a slow rolling managerial hiring process like this offseason more so than normal, because I have not heard even a rumor. Like usually you'll hear sources say the Mets would like to talk to Joe Espada. There's been nothing like that. It's just Craig Counsell, Craig Counsell, Craig Counsell. So I will continue to operate under the thought that Craig Counsell is going to be the Mets' next manager, and I need somebody to give me a name that would make me think otherwise. Like, Connor, are you available? I'm potentially available. It would be a tough negotiation, but I'm willing to talk about it if they want to make that call. But right now, there's nothing.
No, there's nothing out there, and it's been interesting because of the lack of interesting news, where you're like, this is just, do they think they have Counsell wrapped up, or are they truly in a spot where they just have to wait to speak to him and then they'll operate from there? And David Stearns is a guy that knows this league and names that we don't know better than any other, where there could be a list of 8 legitimate candidates, Joe, and it's just not out there. We legitimately,
there's plenty of future managers out there on coaching staffs right now that we don't know who they are because we don't follow the Detroit Tigers bench coach. Like, I don't know who that is, but maybe that person's like a future manager in baseball. So there's always those candidates hanging around. And also, when you talk about David Stearns knowing the game, something tells me he has an idea what Craig Counsell wants to do.
That's kind of the elephant in the room that you look at it and go, wouldn't Stearns know? Wouldn't he know what Craig,
or at least have an inkling, at minimum an inkling? Like, yeah, Craig is definitely wanting to spend his whole career in Milwaukee, or Craig really wants to win a World Series, and Milwaukee just lost Brandon Woodruff for all of next season, and then you have Corbin Burns and Willie Adames in their walk years. Could potentially get traded this offseason, both those guys. So if Milwaukee's going into a retool/rebuild, maybe Counsell says, as much as I love it here, I don't want to sit for 3-4 years until this thing builds back up.
Right. The Brewers are going to be in a fascinating spot because if Woodruff really does miss all 2024, and it's looking like he can, they are in a window where they either have to get another big-time arm in there to go for it again before the two players you brought up, Corbin Burns, incredible player, Willie Adames, obviously a good player, and compete one more year, and then they're not going to be able to bring everyone back. It's a bit of a mess. Or, Joe, they hit the button a little early and go, hey, we got to trade at least one of these guys, and just Counsell want to be a part of that. I mean, you only get so many shots. Yeah, some guys do manage in baseball for a million years. Look at Dusty Baker. Look at all the chances Buck Showalter got, right? But you don't take it for granted. And Craig Counsell, playing as long as he did now, managing, you don't take it for granted. And there might be a relationship there with Stearns, a trust factor of knowing this could be the place that I have the best chance to win. And that's what matters, right? That is what matters to these guys. So we'll keep an eye on where it goes from here. We will obviously react quite quickly when something happens in the Mets managerial search, but not much going on there this week, which takes us, now we got a little fun, Joe, a little lighthearted moment. Before we go into the deep look at our offseason wish list, we have to look back. We have to look back because sometimes all you could do after a disappointing season is laugh not only at the season itself, but laugh at yourselves. Joe and I, for those that are new to this pod, and many of you aren't, we do preseason predictions every year. And I'm sure a lot of them looked pretty good from the 2022 season. When the Mets disappointed in 2023, Joe and I's season predictions could not have disappointed anymore either. So, Joe, I will rapid fire recap them.
Before you go, I just want to preface, if you are new to the Mets pod, before we get into this segment, I want to promise you that we are smarter than this is about to make us sound. That's my I think we're smarter than what this is going to make us look like. I think
we are. Listen, I think what people will realize that aren't just hating is that they probably would have shared a lot of these opinions. Some of them no, some of them are hilarious in their own unique way. But listen, let's jump into it, and we'll stop a few times. And I want to stop at the first one. Biggest surprise for the 2023 Mets. Joe went with David Peterson. A quote from Joe was, "People don't believe how good he is." I followed up saying, "I really wanted to pick David Peterson, Joe, but since you picked him, I'll choose John Curtis."
Wow. Okay. Well, David Pearson had a 3.60 xFIP this year. I saw that on Twitter the other day, and that's better than Garrett Cole and Blake Snell. So David Peterson 2024 bounce back year. Here we go. But yeah, I would say maybe David Pearson was the biggest surprise. I didn't expect him to do as bad as he did. So maybe that was the surprise. I don't know.
I think that we really bought into how untouchable he looked in the spring. And
no runs.
This happens too, where spring training lies, and sometimes it doesn't, though. Sometimes, especially for young players, where you're like, okay, he's turning the corner. Peterson finished 2022 really strong. With Curtis, the Mets were clearly relying on a lot of guys to just fill the 6th and 7th inning role. And Curtis was an arm they'd been stashing because of injury the previous year. And I thought that he would be able to fill one of those mid-reliever roles, and it just didn't work out. The next one, we were absolute geniuses on. Mark Canha hit by pitch over under last year's number of 28. He was hit 17 times this year, Joe. 9 with the Mets, 8 with the Brewers. We both went under. That was set too high. If Canha got hit over 28 times again, that just would have been insane. This is where it starts to get a little doom and gloom. Scherzer or Verlander? First to 10 wins. You said Verlander. I said Scherzer. Scherzer got his 10th win on August 3rd with the Rangers. Verlander got his 10th win on August 27th with the Astros. So, unlike the scoreboard predictions where you demolished me, Joe, I got this one right. But the fact it took till August was probably a bad sign for both. And we will continue. Go ahead.
Hold on. The craziest thing about that, I'm going to try not to stop you too much, but the craziest thing about it, if I told you on March whenever we did this, that it would take till August for both of them, you'd be like, oh, wow, that's weird. They must have missed some time or whatever. And then what would you have thought if I followed up with, oh, and neither would be with the Mets?
Right. There's a lot to unpack here. And the next one, only you answered this one, Joe. Scherzer, Verlander, over under 55 combined starts. In 2022, they made 51. So you went under, and you were right. They made 54 starts, Joe.
Nailed it.
Scherzer, 27, Verlander, 27, 54 starts. So you nailed that one. I said when I was reading the rundown today, I was like, this is better than I thought. Like, I knew we really got pantsed on this. Like, the Mets completely demolished our preseason predictions, but it could have been, it always can be worse. And this is a good example of how bad it can get. Who has more wins? David Peterson, Kodai Senga, or Carlos Carrasco? Joe took Carrasco. I took Peterson. Neither of us were right, and neither of us were totally wrong, because these guys tied. They each had 3 wins. So neither Joe or I won from each other. The problem is Kodai Senga won 12 games. He won twice as many games as the other 2 guys combined, Joe, combined.
Yeah. And the funny part is, I like to think we were the high people on Kodai Senga when 100%. The Mets, we were talking about him since the beginning of the offseason. It wasn't like after they signed him, we got into Senga. We wanted him all along, and we just didn't go with our gut, or maybe we did, but we didn't go with what we thought about Senga. And very funny to look back on the 6 combined wins between our 2 guesses.
All right, so a couple quick ones here. Pete Alonso home runs, over under last year's number. He hit 40 in 2022. He hit 46 this year. We both got that. We both went over. Joe, you predicted 44. You came really close. I said 42-ish. So I was a little, pretty close, not as close as you. He goes over. We both got that one. Luis Guillorme home runs, over under 2.5. We both went over and both said 3. He only hit 1. So we got Pete right. We got Guillorme wrong. The next one is absolutely hilarious. Pick one to happen: a Vogelbach steal, a Tim LeCastro home run, a no-hitter, a steal of home, or someone on the team to hit an inside-the-park home run. Vogelbach, so I'll read him first, actually. Joe, you said inside-the-park home run by Starling Marte. Nobody hit an inside-the-park home run on the team. Starling Marte, unfortunately, couldn't run for much of the year.
Yeah. If someone was going to, it wasn't going to be Starling Marte.
I said... I talked a lot of trash on the Tim LeCastro home run option. He actually hit 2 home runs. It was the only thing that happened on this entire list. Although I did acknowledge it was most likely, and I went with a combined no-hitter.
The most likely thing that happened is Tim LeCastro doing it, but you know what? Forget it. I'm going with a combined no-hitter.
You know why? I said that he wouldn't be on the team long enough. And I was kind of right, but he still hit 2 home runs, even not really being on the team for much of the year. And how I pivoted to a no-hitter, something the Mets couldn't do for, 60 years, is absolutely mind-boggling. I like to think of myself as a calculated human being. I don't know what happened there. Mets over under 93 wins, and what's your number? Joe, you went over. You said 97. I went over and didn't give a number. They won 75 games. They didn't come close. You had them 22 wins over their wins. So you got to laugh when you want to cry. That's close. How I like to put this. The last one, do they make the playoffs? If so, are they a division winner or the wild card? They didn't do any of that. We both said they'd win the NL East. Joe, you said the Braves take a small step back. You weren't in on the Phillies, but that could come back to bite you. The Phillies thing came back to bite you, and it came back to bite me. I had said they had a lot of question marks with Rhys Hoskins had been hurt already. Bryce coming back was an unknown. Bryce Harper is,
unreal.
Modern marvel how he came back this season. And I wasn't confident in Taijuan Walker there. You weren't totally wrong on the Braves because the Braves were an absolute wagon the entire regular season, sure. But they turned into a pumpkin in the playoffs again. And they were honestly maybe even worse than last year. So you weren't totally off there, but we were wrong about the Mets winning the division, which is a massive side. I am not going to predict the Mets to win the NL East in 2024. I just wrote that one down. I am taking the most chalk predictions for the Mets this year. I'm getting this out there now. I'm not predicting them to win the division. I'm taking Kodai Senga for every pitching category. I'm taking either Shohei Ohtani or Pete Alonso for every hitting category. I am taking Yamamoto to be the biggest surprise. I'm not taking any chances, so I can't get dunked on like this. You're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Speaking of some of those characters I named, Offseason Wishlist, Joe, let's kick it off like this. You are a very well-calculated human being, especially when talking about team building with the Mets. Before we get into what we want them to do, what do the Mets need?
Well, Connor, it's been a long time since I've done this because I just use a computer for everything. If you're watching on YouTube, I wrote down.
There we go, Joe.
What I think the needs are. So I will list what I believe the needs are, and then we could talk about different players. I have some suggestions for that, but I'm not just going to, take over the whole segment. But my humble opinion needs 2 or 3 starting pitchers, at minimum 2. Potentially 3, depends if you want to do like a competition for the 5 spot with Peterson, Lucchesi, maybe someone like Mike Vassell, people internally. Multiple relievers, some of which need to be optionable. I know there's a lot of people that have gotten on the Mets for that. They need more impact, but they can't ignore the optionability. Maybe that's a word, but I'm going with it. An actual DH who spends most of the time at that position.
And actually hits the ball?
Yeah, it actually hits. Yeah, an actual DH, designated hitter. A startable 4th outfielder. So that's, with Starling Marte coming off there's potentially another groin surgery to come for Marte. That hasn't been determined yet. So I think they need to cover themselves in the outfield with a quality veteran. Protect the top of the farm system is a need to me. So maybe there's some exclusions that apply, but Jet Williams, Drew Gilbert, Luis Angel Acuna, those are guys that you need to protect. Don't be afraid to be creative in the trade market, which is something David Stearns has always done. Jeff McNeil, maybe, throwing that one out there. Don't be afraid to be creative out there. And the last one is try to extend Pete Alonso, but if you can't, don't trade him.
I like that. I'm with you all the way. I think internally, McNeil is it makes the most sense if you're going to move a vet, right? There's not a lot here. The Mets are very young in a lot of areas, right? And maybe somebody would take on Narvaez, but I actually think that you just keep Narvaez as the backup. Why are you creating another hole? Just create another hole. You're not getting anything back for Narvaez. Yeah. But they're young at catcher with Alvarez. They are going to let some of the infield be figured out by the kids. It's Mauricio or Beatty are going to get a shot to win the third base job. Maybe Mauricio gets looks at second. They're going to get chances is what I'm saying. There's not a lot of spots. Pete, it's a non-conversation. You're not trading Pete Alonso right now. Even if you can't extend him, let him go to free agency and figure it out from there like you did with Brandon Nimmo already. Lindor, incredible player. Lucky to have him at shortstop. You look at the outfield, this is where it starts to get a little dicey. Nimmo's your center fielder. With Marte's status uncertain, you probably need at least a veteran, like a real veteran. I'm not saying like last year they signed Tommy Pham as a 1 year, $6 million deal, fourth outfielder. That's a move that has to happen. I'm talking about even maybe a bigger piece than that for the outfield. I guess we'll see. But there's just not a lot of places. And I guess that's the counter argument to trading McNeil. McNeil is your veteran outfielder, so I get that. But I'm talking about if you're going to move anybody from the day-to-day lineup, he's the only one that might have some trade value. And then the rotation, let's get into some names that could actually fix this thing. You and I have talked, constantly about Yamamoto because he's a frontline starter. And if you get Yamamoto, it gives you this punch of him and Senga at the top that all the really good teams across baseball often have. That 1-2. When you have a 1-2 of aces, you can compete any single year. Then, this is kind of a tough one right now because he might have priced himself out of being the perfect number 3 starter for this team. I mean, when you look at Jordan Montgomery, are those days over at this point, Joe? Like, has he just had this run since being traded that he's going to get frontline money, not mid starter money anymore? What are we looking at for Montgomery?
Yeah, I think Montgomery, he's only 30, turning 31. He was traded at the deadline, so he's not eligible to get the qualifying offer, which helps his free agent value because obviously some teams can be turned off by losing a draft pick. I think you're looking at 4 years maybe, and he's got to be at $20 million a year, right?
I was going to say 25 if it's only 4 years.
Yeah, it's 20 plus. And whatever that number is, because you look at the guys like Taijuan Walker and Jamison Tyone, who got near 20, I think 18, 17, something like that was what those guys got. So Jordan Montgomery probably is pricing himself out a little bit of being that secondary starter that the Mets pursue. I would start, certainly, like you said, Yamamoto. Everyone talks about Yoshinobu Yamamoto. We talk about him all the time, and we're going to continue to do so. He is priority number 1 in this offseason for me. And I would not be outbid for Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Whatever that number ends up being, I think the total commitment when you include posting and everything that comes along with it, I believe that number will be $200 million-ish. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but right in that neighborhood. So it's going to be a very expensive piece, but 25 years old, potential true, unlike Senga. When Senga came over, everybody's projection was possible mid-rotation starter, and he clearly exceeded expectations. Yamamoto is coming over with potential and expectations of being, like you said, Connor, ace, frontline type of starter. He fits exactly what the Mets need. If it's not Yamamoto, then a frontline starter, for me, is not in free agency. They're going to have to go into the trade market and be a little aggressive to get somebody, even if it's a Tyler Glasnow who has 1 year of control that maybe dampens the prospect return a little bit, where you could keep those top guys and lose someone maybe just a tier below that. But Yamamoto's got to be priority numero uno to top this rotation. And, there's some trade candidates that I think are interesting to keep an eye on. I mentioned Glasnow, Dylan Cease from the White Sox. They were willing to talk him at the trade deadline, so maybe that rekindles. He has a couple years of control. Name I'm really interested in, which you might say ew to, or you might be intrigued. I'm not sure. Keep an eye on Chris Sale in Boston.
I'm indifferent.
They're going to be bringing in someone new. He obviously struggled with health, but when he's on the mound, he still can pitch. He's due $27 million this year, with a $20 million team option for 2025. So it's really just 1 year and $27 million. Can you get him for a low return and maybe Boston eats a little money to get out of it? Boston's trying for Shohei Ohtani. They're trying for Juan Soto. Will they also fit Chris Sale in that payroll? Or could you get a prospect to take on all of Chris Sale's money? Maybe not a top guy, but a prospect of some form. That would be one I'd keep an eye on. Then when you look at that second tier of free agent starters that are 1 year deals, 2 year deals, 2 years with an opt-out, something like that, Jack Flaherty, Hyun-Jin Ryu, James Paxton, Luis Severino. When you think names like that, those are names of Those are all guys that have performed at near Cy Young levels at one point in their career, some more recently than others. Some are younger than others, but you're trying to get short-term potential impact at a cost financially that is not obviously in the stratosphere of what they've done previously with the big short term, but just kind of bridge in the rotation for Mike Vassell, who I mentioned before, Blade Tidwell, Tyler Stewart, Dom Hamill, Christian Scott, all the arms that are coming. You definitely want to bridge that gap with some veterans. And those are just a few names that kind of came to mind off the rip. And we'll obviously know many more that are going to become available in trade over the next 2-3 months.
Yeah, this won't be the last time that we talk off-season targets, because there's going to be guys that, I mean, there's players that don't get tendered. There's guys that become obvious trade candidates when they're a year away from free agency because an extension doesn't get done. But I think the way you highlighted it is right on, Joe, where they need a front-end starter. They probably need a back-end starter and probably 2 back-end starters. And when I say back-end, that's even saying like a 4 and a 5, not just a 1-3 and a 6. Either way, it also everything changes, right? If you sign Yamamoto, you feel like you want more quantity on the back end. If you don't get Yamamoto, maybe you go into a strategy where you get a Montgomery and 3 arms that are flyers, but you like the volume you have. And back to Yamamoto, I find him such an interesting topic, right? Because we talk so much about risk. He hasn't pitched on U.S. soil. He's coming over from a different league. But what's fascinating to me, Joe, is that I would counter-argue that the risk with Yamamoto is the same as any other typical free agent because he's 25, where a lot of pitchers that get to free agency are at least 30, that they could be on the wrong side after a year or two where their arm starts breaking down, where, yes, there's performance risk with Yamamoto, but you are getting a guy that hasn't even entered his prime as a pitcher yet, where if you want to be paying somebody, I mean, wow, what is he going to get? It's going to go to $200 million. We know that. I'm trying to think annual average here, Joe. Is he going to touch $30 million a year?
7-8 years, $200 million-ish. Like, it's going to be a long-term deal. I'm sure there'll be an opt-out in there or something because that's right. Like Senga has an opt-out in his deal after year 3, I think. But it's going to be a lot of money. That's what it comes down to.
Right. But I think that on top of all that, me thinking the risk is actually the same as any free agent because he has something in his pocket that not a lot of guys have. He's a 25-year-old superstar free agent. That is very, very unique. As a pitcher, a position in sport that breaks down really like no other. Then you look at it as well. Making sure other teams don't get him is really important here. The Dodgers, a lot of teams in the NL, the Yankees. You don't want Yamamoto going to the Yankees and them having some superstar ace. You want him pitching with Kodai Senga and having the Japanese duo of aces that are the talk of town in New York baseball. These are things that I think matter to Steve Cohen. And there is a competitive aspect to this. Yeah, we don't care, right, like about the Yankees the way that we care about the Phillies and the Braves and these teams in the NL that matter so much. But there is something to being the biggest show in town for the Mets franchise. There's a financial impact. There's a marketing impact. There's a PR impact. There's a total impact. So we have really beaten this into the ground, but Yamamoto is such an ideal free agent signing for the Mets because when you have him in place, all the other needs you said fall into place a little bit easier, where if you don't get him, the pivot point is a lot different than the other positions.
It is. You're 100% right. Because like you said, if you want to go to free agent route, you want to talk about Blake Snell. Blake Snell to me screams BUST of a contract.
I agree.
He's gonna
Carlos
go get paid,
Rodon.
and God bless Blake Snell for it. Like, good for him. To me, I don't think that's going to work out for whoever signs him. So I would not want the Mets to go there. And to be honest, we talk about the qualifying offer. I think the only player that is going to be a free agent that the Mets would consider signing that will have a qualifying offer is Shohei Ohtani, because he's the exception to every single rule that exists in the world, basically. So other than him, I would avoid anyone with that. So if you want to go free agency, then like you said, Connor, you're going Jordan Montgomery, and then you're signing like 2 of those flyer arms or 3 of those, because you're going to need to be deep at that point. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach it. And if they are able to land Yamamoto, I'll be fascinated to hear. And I hope, Steve Gelbs will be at the press conference, and maybe we could tell him to ask for us what's going to be the plan with him and Senga, because obviously we know how Senga was treated this year, which was not every 5th day. He would get 5 days of rest between starts, and they would kind of try to make it work for his adjustment period. Is Senga ready to pitch on a regular American rotation of 4 days in between? If he's not, then guess what? That 2 to 3 I said, it needs to be at minimum 3, because then you have to run a 6-man rotation. No way around it. That's what you have to do. So I'll be fascinated to see kind of how that all works. But like you said, Connor, we've been beating Yamamoto into the ground. But guess what? We're going to probably talk about Yamamoto most weeks until he signs. So the quicker he signs, the quicker we stop talking about it in this light.
So let's quickly touch on some options at the plate for the Mets. You talked about them needing an actual DH. We know Ohtani. There's no one better than Ohtani in that role. But is there any tier B, tier C bats that do fit for the Mets at DH?
We talked about JD Martinez a little bit. I think he's almost an ideal fit because he's probably signing a 1-year deal.
He's like the new Nelson Cruz, right?
Yeah. Just 1 year DH and just go and hit somewhere. We talked about Rhys Hoskins a little bit last week as someone, is he willing to DH in his first year back from the ACL? And he could hedge Pete Alonso a little bit. Teoscar Hernandez is someone we brought up. Old friend Justin Turner, he could still kind of play a little first and third here and there, but he could DH for you. So those are some names for DH. And quickly in the outfield, it's really not a strong outfield market. So when you were talking before, Connor, about, they signed Tommy Pham last year, and you kind of want to be like a step above that. There's not a ton unless you want to spend big money, and I don't think they want to. So Tommy Pham needs to come back on the list. Old friend Jesse Winker, is he someone we want to take a look at? He's struggled now he's struggled for the last year and a half, but I feel like it'd be a funny dynamic to see Jesse Winker with Mets fans. Harrison Bader played across town with the Yankees, and when he was on the field, he was electric. He just has always spent a lot of time injured, and he could be a backup center fielder for you because he can play that position really well. And if you just want a thumper that doesn't do much else but can thump, Hunter Renfroe. He's a guy that David Stearns had brought in previously in Milwaukee. He has multiple 30-plus home run seasons under his belt, so maybe he's someone that could be considered. But those are some names. It's not the strongest offensive free agency class. And fortunately, the Mets don't need a high quantity of offensive positions to be filled. They just need 1 or 2, really.
Winker's an interesting flyer, Joe. I mean, just a guy that with the Reds for years, his OPS would hover between 830 and like 950. I mean, you're talking an offensive powerhouse, and he's been dreadful for the Mariners and the Brewers over the last 2 seasons. And he's only 30. You wonder if he could figure it out. Justin Turner, it's incredible. His age 38 season, 800 OPS. The guy will just hit until the end of time. And the Mets probably need, assuming they don't get one of the top boppers, right? They don't end up with an Ohtani or JD Martinez. Get a veteran like that you like the floor of him to be your DH rather than, they kind of went for ceiling, I felt like, with Vogelbach last year, and it totally bottomed out.
Ceiling? What ceiling?
That he was actually going to hit home runs. Right.
That's fair. Yeah.
That's fair. I mean, Vogelbach is not a high floor player. He's been cut by multiple teams, but at his absolute best with, who is it? I mean, he was an all-star with
Mariners,
the Mariners.
I think.
30 home run season, all-star with the Mariners. That one couldn't have gone worse. You're right. But that was their thinking. Like they gave him the DH job.
Yeah.
So anyway. It did not work. Let's do a fun mailbag question before we close out here, because this is not like a 3-word response, and you're gonna laugh when I read it. I think every Met fan will really appreciate this question and will love to carve out their own answer. So this is from David Thorpe on Twitter. He tweeted at us, Joe. New baseball fan from the UK following the Mets. What 3 things do I need to know about the Mets?
Oh, God.
This is one of the hardest questions of all time. You only get to say, this is a new baseball fan.
Yeah.
He has somehow chosen our lovely New York Metropolitans. And you only get to tell him 3 things. We each are going to give our own 3, but the options are endless here.
I would say passionate fan. This is in no order. Passionate fan base. You are joining a fan base that they are going to listen to this show 12 months a year. They are following every roster move from day 1 of spring training all the way through the winter, and not all fan bases can say that at the level that we can. This is really tough. I can't believe how difficult this is. I've been a Mets fan for 30 years, and 3 things they need to know. Passionate fan base is 1. You go with 1 while I think. Let's back and forth maybe a little.
I think for me, it's the underdog, right? That's how I've always felt as a Mets fan. And I feel like it's a little different if you're younger than us. We are in our 30s. I think if you're a teenage Mets fan, it might not feel this way. Our timeline, you and I, is that growing up, the Yankees were a powerhouse, right? You had the 90s. The Yankees always had talent. They spent a ton of money. They're an international brand. And our Mets had some really good teams. I mean, really, really good teams. You look at 2000, even 99 was scrappy. 2006, they should have won the World Series. 15 was still lightning in a bottle. And we had a ton of fun watching that team. But it didn't always feel like, it didn't feel the same as some of the other teams. They just got hot at the right time. Still appreciate it all the same. But despite that, the Mets are always the second New York baseball team. And I think over the years, it's tough after this season, but the Yankees didn't play very well either. Steve Cohen is hell-bent to change that. And it kind of has coincided with things have not gone well for Brian Cashman and the Yankees for a long time now. They still spend a lot of money, but they are really up against it in the American League. They are not the Yankees that we grew up watching. And I think why I say underdog is the Mets fan base holds that with a lot of pride. Like each time the Mets beat the Yankees and the Empire State Building is orange and blue, it means a little bit more. The next day you're on the subway and you see somebody with a Mets hat or a Mets jersey. You go to Citi Field and you feel the energy of the Mets fan. You take the 7 train to the game. I'm not saying Yankees fans don't have this, but the Mets were always the second team. And there is a different pride factor that I see with the Mets because they're laughed at, they're mocked, they're not taken seriously. And it's one of the more proud traits of this fan base, because if you're a Mets fan, a lifelong Mets fan, is kind of what you hinted at, Joe. There's something to that that's different than rooting for most franchises across the world.
For sure. It's definitely a blue collar in a sense. It feels that
Curtis
way.
Granderson said it
if
once.
You want to compare. Yeah, Granderson said it feels blue collar. I mean, I've gone to Yankee Stadium. I've gone to Citi Field. You pull up the Yankee Stadium, you almost feel like you're going to like a museum or a library, right?
It's very corporate.
Like. So yeah, it definitely is. So I would say another thing, if you want to look ahead, so you're starting brand new. We're going to talk about the history of the Mets a little bit for you as well, but look ahead. You're joining, like if you're right now becoming a Mets fan, this might be like the perfect time in theory to be like birthed as a Mets fan. Steve Cohen's a couple years into ownership. So the Mets, a new fan, if you don't know, the Mets have the richest owner in the sport. They hired one of the very best executives in the sport. They've built up a farm system that's among the top 10 or so in baseball, and it's going in an up and right trajectory. So there are better days ahead for the Mets. And you talk about how the Mets have always been the underdog and the little brother of New York City.
I wouldn't say
I do think those days, I'm not saying they're changing right now, but one team seems to be going up and one team seems to go in the opposite direction. And I think he's joining the right team. But also, I guess for number 3, some of the history of the team. What you want to know is they've had some fantastic players, although they have not had many World Series wins. 69, 86. That's it. So they haven't won many World Series, and the Yankees have won 27, and all these other teams have won all these World Series. The Mets have 2. But you want to know the names, Tom Seaver. You want to know the name, like Nolan Ryan pitched for the Mets. You want to talk about the mid-'80s teams, all the great players that played for them. Keith Hernandez, who you'll see on SNY, Doc, Darryl, who are getting their numbers retired, Ron Darling, just fantastic. Like the 86 team is probably one of the better baseball teams of the last 35, 40 years. 2000 team, you have Piazza, you have Alfonso, you have the greatest defensive infield ever. The 06 team, you brought Beltran in and Delgado, and you had David Wright homegrown, Jose Reyes. So you've had some fantastic teams. So there is some good Mets history, although it comes with a lot of, like we have said before, kind of LOL Mets, that's so Met. Like that whole thing has always been a thing. And that may peek its head out every now and then going forward, but toughness is something that you have to have as a Mets fan. So be prepared to deal with a lot of stuff.
And I'll add one last one here because I agree with you with their history, especially in pitching. I mean, this is a franchise that has had all-time greats pitch for them. Tom Seaver, Dwight Gooden, Jacob deGrom, right? You said Nolan Ryan, drafted by the Mets. The last thing for me is the Mets have the best booth in baseball. And watching the Mets every single night, no matter if they've lost 10 games in a row, no matter if they're in last place, they're in first place, they're just treading water in the wild card race. Watching the Mets every single night is an absolute joy. And I say that as somebody that has found their way into sports media. I never thought I'd be broadcaster in any sense. And I find myself trying to pick things up from them for the last, 12 years or so. And even nights I don't feel like thinking about it from a work perspective, it's like listening to your favorite podcast in the booth. The history between Keith and Ronnie, Gary, a lifelong Mets fan, turned into the voice of the Mets. It's like watching the Mets, no matter the status of the season, is so easy to do. And that's crazy to say. It's crazy. I don't say that about any of my other teams. When things are going really wrong for the Jets, the Rangers, the Knicks, whoever it is, I'm like, my God, this is going to be pretty tough today. But with the Mets, it's such an easy team to watch. Quick SNY promo there. But I truly, truly mean it. It is incredible no matter the state of the season. So with that, we'll close out the show. We got a little off-season wish list, but that is not the last of it. We will be talking about this team and the moves they can make or will make throughout the long, long winter. This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today, and remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.